Okay, everyone. Great to see everyone here today. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the first in a three-part series, Men Overcoming Silence and Finding Strength in Vulnerability. Our panel today will unpack the concept of toxic masculinity and discuss the struggles men face as they attempt to rewrite the social narrative which pressures them to be strong and silent. So let's start by meeting our panelists. First off, we have Michael Blanton. After a career in public administration and politics, Michael changed paths when he founded Lions Pride Coaches and began helping men break the barriers to becoming authentic males in today's society. Michael is a certified trauma recovery coach, a certified Namah meditation instructor, and a registered yoga instructor 200. He utilizes this skill set along with Eastern philosophies to help men redefine healthy masculinity in the settings of one-on-one group coaching, men's circles, meditation workshops, yoga classes, and retreats. Michael has a bachelor's degree in East Asian Studies and an MBA with concentration in public administration. Thanks for joining us, Michael.
Thanks for having me, Jami.
And next we have Bradley Hall. Bradley is also a certified trauma recovery coach, a certified mindfulness instructor, a holistic transformational life coach, and spiritual advisor. He founded the LIT Academy in 2018 to provide instruction and facilitate dialogue to ultimately help others facilitate their own self-healing and growth. Bradley specializes in helping people transform their lives by focusing on themselves. His unique approach and vast understanding of psychology, philosophy, and spirituality make him a highly sought-after personal coach. He is currently pursuing his PhD in Jungian archetypal psychology at Pacifica Graduate Institute in Carpinteria, California. Welcome, Bradley.
Thanks for having me, Jami. I'm happy to be here.
Great. So we're going to start today with the basic question, and I'll start with Michael. When does masculinity become toxic?
It's thanks for the question, Jami, and good morning, everybody. Good morning, Bradley.
Good morning,
and
Michael.
Thank you, Sarah, for helping so much with our forum. That's a really interesting question, isn't it? And it really comes down to, is there a healthy definition of masculinity? And I think we can explore that throughout this series on the forum. But I think in its simplest form, toxic masculinity is masculinity that crosses a line in terms of causing harm, and that harm can be harm to others. I think it could be harm to self, especially self and the small circle of other male figures within a group who look at that as role modeling. And I think as we embrace healthier definitions of masculinity, then we can erode away at some of the more negative aspects, because I think sometimes what gets lost in discussions of toxic masculinity is the assumption, sort of a subliminal assumption, that all masculinity is toxic. And that's just not the truth. And it kind of comes from a no-win standpoint, if you will, that there are healthy types of masculinity that encourage positive societal benefits, that encourage positive dialogue, men amongst each other, men in their interaction with people of other genders, a whole host of different concepts there. I think that's kind of it in a nutshell. I don't know if Bradley would like to weigh in on this as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a deep subject, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about it. So just broaching the surface, I think you're exactly right. One of the biggest key things I think that you said was that it's been, because the conversation of toxic masculinity has come up, suddenly and people are identifying, there seems to be a shift that in an ideology that all masculinity is toxic. And I think that's an important point that you make. And hopefully through this conversation today, we'll be able to kind of break that down a little bit and be able to identify what is toxic and what is not toxic. The other curious thing that that I'm currently struggling with and working on personally is, what is masculinity, and how do we define that in general? I know there's a lot of questions currently in conversations around gender identity and traits, and what is masculine, what is feminine, what is male, what is female, that kind of thing. So I think that kind of begs the question that, are we at a crossroads where we should discuss that portion of it, of what is acceptable to be called masculinity, and then what is toxic and what is healthy.
Those are excellent observations, Bradley. That concept of, is there a healthy type of masculinity? And I'd go further to state that there could be and are several different types of healthy masculinity. And I think sometimes we as a society might get caught in trying to bring that down to the lowest common denominator and just try to fit it into a box and say, healthy masculinity looks like the Marlboro Man, or healthy masculinity looks like the softball coach, or healthy masculinity looks like your favorite college professor, whatever it might be, and sort of stop there and not recognize that this has implications for the straight community, the homosexual community, people who identify as various genders and their communities, international, traditional, and historical lenses through which we see masculinity. There's a whole host of flavors, if you will, and I don't think there's one particular definition. That's part of what makes it so complicated. Yeah.
Well, and in our society, everything defaults to a binary outlook. In our society, everything is either or. You're either Democrat or Republican. You're either liberal or conservative. You're either gay or you're straight, or you're a man or you're a woman, or whatever the case may be. And I know that we're progressing to dissolve that. And I think that's critical in this conversation, that, here we're talking about men or people that identify as a man. But I think healthy masculinity, and we don't have to spend a whole lot of time on this because we are here for the people that identify as male, but masculinity and the balance of masculine and feminine traits in both male and female are critical for overall health. And so I think, to get back to the original question of the toxic masculinity, the problem is that we over-identify. We're out of balance, that we put too much energy into masculinity and not enough into our feminine energy as a male, which gets down to defining those again, right? But being emotional, being nurturing, those kind of things. And we've seen I think we've made strides to a certain extent in our society, but I think the conversation didn't come with it. So we've seen the rise of the supportive father, men taking on stay-at-home dads and that kind of thing as being more acceptable in our society. But I think we're not having conversations and working through it and being able to process that. And so it causes a repression of what we think is masculinity, or what we project as masculinity. And that repression builds and builds and builds. And a lot of times I think that's what comes out as toxic masculinity. When we feel that we're being repressed, we're not allowed to be who we are, or we're not masculine enough for society. We feel that judgment, and that judgment's heaped on us, and we judge ourselves that we're not masculine enough. And then we go over and above and beyond to create that, or to prove to ourselves or other people that we're masculine. And a lot of times I think that's what causes that hypermasculinity that's toxic.
I love what you just said there. That's a fantastic term, hypermasculinity. And I think the pejoratives that come with that, I think about, what are the origins of toxic masculinity or hypermasculinity? And oftentimes toxic masculinity was, in some way, shape, or form, we talk about toxic masculinity needs to be eliminated from society, but maybe not all of it. And I'm not saying that is my preference. I'm saying that is a societal requirement. I'm thinking about men being called up for times of war, not expected to back down. Talk about men working in dangerous working conditions and expected to sort of put their life on the line. We're talking first responders, military personnel, a whole host, or even people who are participating in an athletic event. There's no crying in baseball and things like
Right.
that is programmed into men as little children. And it starts there. And it grows, and it's often generational. Dad taught me like grandpa taught him, so forth and so on, that boys don't cry. If you cry, I'll give you something to cry about, and various mantras that get passed down generationally. And then we wonder why, as a society, we then struggle with challenges with regard to, I love the term you use, hypermasculinity, that idea that men don't have the full access to the full range of emotions. And there's a cry for men to have that now. But there's also a little portion of society that kind of benefits from men maybe not having full access to the full range of, we don't want our military men to have access to fear. We want them to be fearless because there's a benefit that comes there. And that translates into a whole host of different societal expectations upon men that men struggle with now as we try to find the balance between serving a society that wants men to behave in a certain way at certain times, not in others, and having access to a full range of emotions and feelings, get in touch with their senses of vulnerability and shame, but at the same time, in small doses, in appropriate doses given to the situation. And it's a fine balance.
It's an incredibly fine balance, and balance being the key. So you said so many things I want to touch on. We are not going to have enough time today. I can promise you that. No. But when we look at it from the balance aspect, you're absolutely right. There's a place in this world for every type of human being, and including men who are hyper masculine. The problem becomes, and you touched on this, is it becomes out of balance, like I said earlier. And so what we're not giving, and I'm going to use soldiers and police officers and firefighters. I'm a former firefighter. I come from the public safety arena. I can speak. Thank you. I can speak to this. And we all know veterans and thank you to any veterans here who have served. We all know veterans who are struggling with what they experienced, and then they were just let go. And I think the problem becomes, I know the problem is that the lack of fear that you were talking about is ignorant lack of fear. And there's a difference between an educated lack of fear and an ignorant lack of fear. The ignorant lack of fear is I'm immortal and nothing can happen to me. And that's ego. That's a dangerous mindset.
10 foot tall and bulletproof.
Exactly. Then you experience all these horrible things, and then you go back out into normal society where they're not experiencing these things, and you're supposed to just be able to take it because this is who you are. And you realize you're not invincible. And then you got to struggle with your vulnerability, and it becomes a fight with the ego to try to repress all those emotions and feelings. So we have to give, and this is going to go across the board for all men that we're talking about right now, but I'm just talking about what the examples you used. I've had this conversation with a lot of people. There was a police officer a few years ago in Texas, and he was called to a pool party where some kids came in and crashed the pool party, and there was a 14-year-old African-American girl that he took down on video, and it went viral and that kind of thing. It's my understanding that police officer had run on a suicide previously to that run, right? So that human being had no business going and trying to interfere with a crisis when he had just left and had not processed a crisis himself. And because there are all kinds of emotions that come along with that. And I have been there, and there is nothing. So those emotions are just completely repressed. And when we continue to repress them, they build. and they come out in unhealthy ways unless we can learn to monitor and process and challenge and channel those into healthy masculinity.
Mm.
So not having this conversation that we're having right now with every single person that identifies as male, especially children when they, start going through puberty or whatever, and teaching them about responsibly handling their emotions, then we just repress them. And it becomes like a pressure cooker. If you don't have that top on the pressure cooker open, that whole lid's eventually going to just completely blow off. And I think that's what we see in these circumstances.
Oh, sure, absolutely. I think just looking at recent pop culture, I think you were posting not long ago about the whole issue that happened there between Will Smith and Chris Rock, and that inappropriate display of violence. But then we start digging into, well, what led up to that? What happened there? We could speculate all day long, but I think we saw a clearly publicized, televised example of exactly what you just pointed on out. The pressure cooker reaching a certain boiling point and then saying, okay, I don't know how exactly to respond to this situation, so I'll knee-jerk respond to what I think is the best response at the time, and clearly it wasn't.
Right. Yeah, that's a great example. And I was, I felt like I was one of the few people who took a step back from that and was like, again, we're this dichotomous society. Everybody was like, either Will was a hero for doing what he did, or he was, just the opposite. And I was like, wait, there's a whole lot more going on under the surface here, especially for someone who lives his entire life tap dancing with a mask on in front of the whole world. That's all he does. I can't imagine how much damage, and we know a little bit about his backstory because of his book and that kind of thing. And now that we're digging into this is a great example of what I was talking about. His whole life has just been a TV show, and he may not be processing things like he needs to process. And obviously they erupted right on national TV. Nobody rationally does that, right?
Agreed.
Yeah, so it was a completely irrational response.
There's so much more we could open up on this.
Yeah. I mean, it comes down to an emotional dysregulation of trauma.
Absolutely.
And it goes back to when you're 8 years old and you, I don't know, get hit with a baseball. To go back to your no crying in baseball. You're 8 years old and you get hit with baseball and it hurts like hell. And what do? You want to cry. Everybody's watching you.
Right.
All of your peers, all of your buddies, your parents, your coach, your dad, whoever. And there is that pressure to not cry in front of everyone. And, unfortunately in this society, not only men aren't allowed to cry, but women aren't allowed to cry either. I mean, we've got this, everyone, I talk about this all the time in all the work that I do. Everybody apologizes for crying.
Isn't that sad? I mean, because it's a normal human reaction. And you're right, this affects both men and women. And nobody in society really enjoys a hysterical person. And whether that's a hysterical woman or a hysterical man, nobody really accepts that or enjoys that. And the person who's feels they're in a position where we need to apologize for having our own feelings and emotions and dealing with our trauma in a way that's visible and uncomfortable to others. But isn't that the truth of life, is that so many of our negative, challenging circumstances in life are going to be uncomfortable for us, and for those around us who see us and know us and care about us, it's going to be uncomfortable for them as well. But how we deal with them and how we allow people to process those thoughts, feelings, and emotions, I think will define our better way forward in society, and for women and men and people who identify otherwise. Yeah.
Well, and it comes down to what's acceptable, right? So we're hedonistic. We try to find the shortest path to feeling better. And I think that's Western culture in general, but I think that's probably humanity in general as well. It's probably just hardwired into our system, and our ego does a very good job of helping us do that. But we will do what is acceptable to do that. And for a male, it's easy to channel that sadness and that hurt into rage.
Mhm.
Easy. Especially when you factor a grown man and you factor testosterone into the equation. Testosterone is more than willing to help with that transition into rage. Let's get it out. And I recently had a very traumatic discovery and about my parentage. And I've done so much work. I had an event about 17 or 18 years ago that radically changed my life. I've done so much trauma work. I'm a completely different human being. When this happened to me about 3 or 4 years ago, it sent me into a tailspin that I haven't experienced in 17 years. Now, luckily, I knew how to regulate myself, but it still was so manifested into so much rage. And I went on a 3-day weightlifting binge with old heavy metal that I hadn't listened to in a long time. And it was just, I'm sure I said a couple of words that I can't repeat here, but I knew that was beyond my control for my trauma. My trauma had taken that and manifested it into rage before I got a chance to get to any of it. And I had to process it. And so I went and beat the hell out of my own body. But it naturally, that's my point. It naturally manifested in that rage because that's what's acceptable in our society. If we can get it to where we're okay to cry and just sit down and just, I always ask people in forums, how many of you people have had a really good cry and not felt better afterwards? And everybody knows what that feels like, to cry it out and to feel better. But that's not what's acceptable. What's acceptable is going out and smashing something because you saw your dad smash something, or you see it on TV, or we see it in athletics and that kind of thing, because it permeates and dominates our society.
It's excellent what you just said. I was just studying a piece by Stephen Porges, and he's the author of the polyvagal theory, and talks about how this is programmed into our biology, and that oftentimes when we are subjected to trauma, and then we bury ourselves in something, whatever it might be. In the case that you just quoted, I've been there too. Run to the gym, go get it all out there. Or some people choose the path of drugs and alcohol, or a whole host of ways to bury the feeling that's uncomfortable, that we don't want to deal with. And it all comes down to dissociation. And oftentimes we think of dissociation as just not participating in an activity or an action. Well, sometimes dissociation looks like burying ourselves in some other distraction so that we don't have to do the uncomfortable work of facing our difficult feelings, feeling them, processing them, and then coming out the other side, as you talked about, having a good cry, and then coming out the other side feeling a whole lot better. The problem might not be solved, but the pressure, the emotional pressure and the biological pressure has subsided to a great degree. And once our minds are clear, then we can better process what are the healthier ways to potentially deal with challenges and difficulties in our lives.
Yeah, you're absolutely. And to go back what you mentioned earlier, you just touched on it again, but about that, the balance, the awareness, and the fear, right? So moving from that ignorant fear to that more, that awareness, that educated fear that we'll call awareness, moving from that takes practice, right? And the more we can do it, so what we see in soldiers and that ignorant fear is false strength. And this is where toxic masculinity comes in. It's false strength. I'm gonna beat people up in public and intimidate people and bully people to make myself. It's a projection. We're making ourselves feel more empowered by trying to convince other people we're more empowered. But the movement into that educated fear that's true strength. When you can be aware that you're afraid, but you have complete control over what's happening. You have that. And Michael, I know that you're into mindfulness and meditation as well. When we can learn to step back and separate our emotions from our thoughts, which is incredibly hard to do. and have that awareness of what's happening, and then we can make decisions in the face of that fear that have compassion, that intermix compassion and everything. That's true strength. That's I hate to rip off. I can't remember his name. I can't believe I just drew a blank with that. But the term quiet strength is a term that I like to use a lot, because that is a different position when you get to that point. You have control and you know how to channel it and you know how to process it, and you can cry. You're not afraid to cry because you're not concerned of the opinions about who you are and people seeing you, that you know your value, you know your strength, you know your worth. That's true strength, in my opinion.
Guys, this is some really great dialogue here. And I'm just wondering, for the men that are listening and who have had this conditioning baked into them and are surrounded by the conditioning, how do they take that first step? You know, having that courage to what does the first step look like?
Well, I'm going to jump in here and say the first step is doing what these men here have done today, and that's trying to raise your awareness. The fact that there are people here listening about this tells me, I mean, there are a lot of people that are still unconscious, have no idea, but the fact that people are here tells me that they've identified that they would like to do something differently in their lives. And I that's the first step. That's the key.
When you said that, Bradley, you're exactly right. I keep thinking about that Matrix moment, the blue pill or the red pill. Yeah. You got to wake up. First step, got to wake up and see through our own programming, see through what's happening there. You know, and I think also it involves, we talk about strength. What's so important for people in society, and men especially, is that concept of bravery. And what is braver than stepping outside of a comfortable space and embracing something new, something challenging, something that changes our perspectives and allows us to grow? It's a difficult step to take, but it does require strength. It requires bravery. It requires open-mindedness. And it does come with the risk of potential shame. And that's something we've described in the description of this forum, something that we would talk about. And I think it speaks directly to the concepts we're discussing. The idea that, well, if I don't abide by the social programming that's accepted by the majority, historically, contemporary, you know, in a contemporary setting, if I don't subscribe to that programming, well, what I might be ostracized. And that's the very definition of shame, isn't it? Shame, you know, where does shame come from? It's an emotion. It's a legitimate emotion that we all experience. And where does it come from? It comes from a need to keep people in line in society, that if we conform, we'll be accepted. If we cease to conform or question, we may risk being ostracized from the tribe. And if we're ostracized from the tribe, we're out on our own. And then we're not as likely to survive in the wild if we look at it from a very basic survival lens. But then we fast forward in today's modern culture, if we question the paradigm too much, we could be ostracized and we could be cast out of family settings, career settings, public settings, and die a social death or a public death or a career death or a relationship death. All of those things can come with that idea of confronting something that might be shameful. And some of the feelings that we've described, people would be very quick in society in general to describe men who don't act as the given type. They could be behaving in a shameful manner, could be ridiculed by men, by women, by various other people in society. And I think it's interesting to think about, why is it that men have such a difficult time with shame? And I think it comes to an admission of fault, weakness, a whole host of things that I think people in general have a very difficult time being authentic with.
Yeah, and great point about conditioning. there's a couple things I want to say about that. First, there's there are a lot of studies like this, and I can't cite the study, and I'm sorry that I don't have the information in front of me. But there was a study where that they did with monkeys, and that they had a banana at the top of a pole, and the monkeys could climb up, or bananas probably, and they could climb up to this pole and they could get bananas. And then they began shocking the monkeys as they tried to get up the pole and get to the bananas. And so obviously the monkeys learned not to go up the pole. Then they started replacing the monkeys one by one with a new monkey into the group. And eventually they had replaced all the monkeys in the group with new monkeys, and not one of those monkeys attempted to go up to the pole. Right. So it was all hearsay. It was all secondhand knowledge. They had learned from the other group. And I think that's a survival instinct from evolution, that we've gained this, that we act like people around us. We do the things around us for survival reasons. And we see it in animals. I mean, the small animals will imitate their puppies will imitate other puppies, or whatever the case may be. So I think that's a very valid thing, that we talk about societal pressure. And what I see happening with like this confronting our toxic shame, sometimes the shame can be toxic. It's very toxic. We're not aware of it. We don't know how to process it. But a lot of times what we see happen is people begin to identify the shame, and then they become toxic in the opposite direction, where they begin to rebuke society and other people's opinions completely. And I think the answer lies in the middle, right? We want to be like people around us. That's how we identify with people. We're social creatures. That's why fashion trends happen. That's why music trends happen. It's just kind of who we are. So I don't think it's a bad thing, but it's the unconsciousness, not having awareness of what we're adopting and what we're not adopting. One of the things that a lot of people I work with, that I make a point of, is that we agree to build our personality. We make small agreements along the way about who we are. And so who we are right now is really a conglomeration of a lot of very small decisions we made along the way. And we've seen children, small children, toddlers, put on their father's hat and pick up a beer can and walk around, or their mother's shoes, or whatever, or say things they shouldn't say because they picked it up from a parent. And so what they're doing is they're building their personality. So and most of it's unconscious before the age of 7. We don't even realize it's happening. But one of the examples I use, I've had people tell me they're lifelong Cubs fans, and come to find out, their father was a Cubs fan, and their grandfather was a Cubs fan, and his father before him. And so somewhere along the line, they just agreed to be a Cubs fan because that's what other people around them do. So we make up our own personality. We get to make these decisions, even if we were unconscious when we did it. We had no idea that was what was happening. And it even happens, 90% of our life is unconscious anyway. So we're adapting habits of people that we're around all the time anyway, even as adults. Even right now, we think we're in control, but we're really not. So we're picking up all these habits that we see. And we see that with, trendy language and that kind of thing that we mentioned earlier. So the key there is to know that that's okay, but to be, as we get older and raise our consciousness and our awareness, and be able to identify, and then be able to select what is healthy and what is not healthy, and not just think that I'm just born this way. That's I hear that all the time. And that is just a victim mentality of just giving in to reacting to whatever happens around you, and not taking control as much as you can. And so to get back to your shame, the toxic shame, it's, if you're in a workplace and somebody taught you to do a job, and your manager taught you to do a job, and that's how you do your job, and the guy next to you is how he does his job, and the guy, the woman next to them, that's how they do their job. And then somebody comes in and starts to do it differently, everybody looks at that person like he's crazy, right?
Because we've always done it the other way.
We've always done it the other way. This is how we do it. We've all trained each other. This works. And that person is they're either going to fail miserably, and our judgment's justified, or they're going to succeed and, become a multi-gazillionaire because they patented something new, whatever the case may be. But that person, if they're going to patent something new and become a gazillionaire, they had to reject the judgment that was coming from their peers. to be able to move in a direction that they thought was best for them.
No, those are excellent points, Bradley. And I'm reflecting upon your statement that the tragedy of those Cubs fans, because clearly, they should be Red Sox fans, but we could argue that another day.
I'm sorry. Well, we should have talked before, and I would have asked you which team you wanted.
Any thoughts from our moderators as to where we might want to go with our continued discussion?
Well, I was intrigued by Bradley's comment about people saying that they were born that way. And I think for many people, they actually believe it when they say that because they don't recognize the conditioning. And we can say that for so many aspects of our personality and behavior unrelated to masculinity. So do either of you recall when you actually first became consciously aware of the conditioning and decided to make that change? And if you can pinpoint that, what were the obstacles to that? Like your surroundings, the people around you, were they receptive to it? Or did it take a process for you to find a place where you were able to start this period of growth?
I do. Mine was very, very clear. I had, that's the situation that I was talking about 17 years ago, that my wife and I had been married. I don't even know at that point, almost 15 years. And we had 2 children, and I was a firefighter in this small town, and my kids were student athletes in this town. I coached everyone's in Little League. We had a great life, but internally, our marriage was coming apart because I was coming apart from my childhood trauma, and I ended up having an affair on my wife that was a scandal in the town, and it completely destroyed my reputation and my career. We had no friends. We had to actually move to a different town because of it, and it caused such a stir from a scandal for various reasons. One, because the scandal came out and half the people judged me. And then the other half identified with me. And then when I began to change, that other half judged me and no longer wanted anything to do with me. And so it was it was an incredibly lonely process that really just involved my wife and I. I mean, I just dug in and decided to make that change. So it was a very dark period for about 2 years. And I don't know how I made it through, but I can tell you the fact that I did make it through, that I was committed to it. And I had the support of my wife, that when I talk about rejecting the judgment and the shame and the toxicity from other people and being able to sort out what is best for me and what is not for me, I'm coming from personal experience, because I lived that horrible nightmare for about 2 years. It's a very, very dark place to be. But once I emerged from that, I came out stronger than I could have ever even imagined, happier than I ever could have imagined. It's why I do the work that I do now. And my foundation is almost unshakable. I say almost because 3 years ago, I told you 3 years ago, I had another experience that rocked me and sent me into a tailspin that I wasn't expecting. It just dug a little deeper in the trauma, the bottom of the barrel that I didn't know was there. But yeah, that's my answer.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Bradley. That's incredibly brave for you to come right on out there and put it right on out there. So that's to be commended. Thank you so much for sharing that. And it's interesting when you share these times and troubles and tragedies, there's going to be people who are going to fall on various sides of hearing that. Some people will reject it, some people will accept it, and some people will, the vast majority of people will like, well, it didn't affect my life personally. So unfortunately, most people are apathetic. But you ask about these questions, these times when we go through these trials that have changed our life. I know for me, I went through a period of time where I had worked so hard to be a public servant in my hometown, my home community, and I was doing extremely well with that. And then got into a very toxic relationship. Didn't realize it at first. anyone who's ever studied narcissistic abuse can certainly commiserate and understand what it's like to be stuck in a relationship like that. And it culminated in really the destruction of everything that I had spent a decade of public service, but a lifetime in a community building on up, where I went from a person who was celebrated and looked up to a person who was accused of various crimes, went through the whole legal process, went from celebrated to incarcerated. And I thought, what in the world happened to my life? What happened? And found myself in an extremely dark, dark place that I never expected I would end up in my lifetime. And then coming out of that, but for the grace of God, in my case, there go I. And then a whole lot of work into therapy, self-reflection, self-analysis, self-care, and then kind of, Bradley, like you were talking about, going through a movement from a community to another community, but also the revelations that you learn in your process of growth and healing, what your truths are, knowing what actually happened, what others perceive happened. And for me, it was particularly challenging as a man who'd been victimized by a woman. That was a really hard narrative to explain to people. There were a lot of people who just rejected that at face value, just would not accept that's not possible. It can't happen. I think intelligent people out there realize that's not the case. That's not the truth. But there were some people that came along with that. And that was very, very encouraging and an intrinsic part, and a necessary part of my healing journey to move on into a little bit more self-awareness of who I was, what my truth was, learning how to speak that in the face of adversity. And I'm still in the process of doing that now, to be quite honest. So engaging in forums like this, engaging in conversations, difficult conversations like this, have been a big part of my healing. And I think that's, as we both kind of alluded to, we have to wade on into those difficult conversations. That's the way out is through.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't disagree, or I couldn't agree with that more. I appreciate you sharing that. I find it ironic that in this forum that you and I have opposite ends of the spectrum. In my situation, I created my own disaster, and through childhood trauma, things that have been undealt with, traumatic things, and there's some traumatic things that happened to me in my childhood that a lot of people aren't aware of. They manifested as that toxic masculinity, which culminated in having an affair. It was destroying my marriage. I wasn't secure. I was full of toxic shame. I had no foundational identity to build upon, and that instance caused that. So mine was self-created, and then yours appears that it was being a victim to another circumstance. And I think it's amazing that we have those different perspectives and different angles here today, pulling them into really the same ideology and the same focal point. To your last point about that we have to see it through. I use an analogy, a fire analogy, because I'm retired firefighter, of course. In a fire, most people who die in a fire, it's from smoke inhalation, and most of them are found either under a piece of furniture, usually the bed, or in a closet. And the reason this is important from a psychological standpoint is that we can sit here and all agree that if your house is on fire, the hiding under a bed or a closet probably isn't going to spare you from the fire. The fire is going to go where it wants to go and find you if it gets there. But the panic logic, they're in a panic, and so they immediately they want to hide. And so the reality is if that person was aware and the fire was, let's say they were upstairs, and the fire was on the stairs, and the front door of the home is right at the base of the stairs. And let's say they can't jump for some reason, because that's part of the conversation, but they have a choice to either hide in a victim mentality, waiting, hoping that someone comes and saves them, or the fire's going to get them, or to not be in that victim mentality. They can run through the fire and get outside to safety. They might get burned in the process, but they guarantee that they're going to survive. And I think working through our trauma is a lot like that. At some point, we have to move through the fire to get outside to safety. And we may suffer a few burns on the way out and get a few more scars as we're reprocessing, but in the long run, we'll be much better off.
Excellent.
This is just such incredible dialogue. Thank you guys so much. I truly believe that when we share our personal struggles and our stories that are difficult to talk about, we give other people permission to do the same thing. And so this is the first step in helping men, helping everybody understand this issue, and maybe be a little bit more willing to take that first terrifying step on a staircase that they can't see where it's leading to. And gosh, I have goosebumps listening to your stories. And the analogy with the fire of wanting to hide from something that's going to be painful, that's embedded in us from the day we're born. You know, nobody likes to feel pain, which is why we're so good at numbing it. And if only we were taught from the day we were born that we need to feel it in order to be free from it. I'd like to take a few minutes here to check in with Sarah Masat, who's been awesome at letting people in here and monitoring our chat. Is any questions or comments, Sarah, that we can address?
There's some great comments and a few questions as well. Bill said, I thank my family for not telling me not to cry when I was growing up, and it has made me a much better human male for it. That's so cool. And Rick asked a few questions, but I'm going to start with the last question he asked, which is, how do we heal from childhood trauma? Because I know that's a really massive, important question. I don't know if you want to take that on right now.
Sure. I mean, it is a massive question, and it's a complex question, but I think we've kind of alluded to it. Bradley said a few things about it. I did as well. Just that idea. The first step is the first step. It's acknowledging the challenge, and then seeking expert advice from people who have already gone the road ahead to try to help chart our way through. For men in particular, there seems to be, and I don't know if it's a societally imprinted block or if it's biological or whatever it is, but so many of the male friends that I have, when I've talked about doing therapy, you know, the shields up, Captain, and like, whoa, you know, that's not interested. And usually when I hear not interested, it comes across in a really butch macho way, but I've learned to decipher that. And what that usually means is I'm terrified of what I might find. And so I'm not going to go there. The idea of engaging in therapy is at the very least just confronting our challenges and issues, finding out where they're rooted, what the foundation is, and then beginning to unravel the pieces of that. And that work can then be followed on up with by either a trauma recovery coach like all of us. It can be done in a host of different healing self-care modalities. That's, I mean, just the nutshell version I can think of as far as starting is the place to start.
Yeah, and I agree with everything you said. And I would also add, one of the thing that I'm really big on is, let me start over. I want to say that differently. One of the most pivotal moments in my entire life, I was participating in something like this, and I admitted on Zoom that I had been sexually abused as a child. That was one of the most terrifying things that I ever said in my entire life. And the moment I said it out loud to a group of people, it changed immediately. some of the pressure was let off. And the next time I talked about it, some of the pressure was let off even more. And the more that I talked about it, the more normalized it became for me in my mind. And now I don't just walk around just blurting that out, because there's a time and a place for everything, right? I don't want people to just be like, you know, dude, we're in a restaurant. But I'm not afraid to bring it up and talk about it when the conversation warrants it. So I think talking about it, and that's to your point, Michael, finding a professional, a therapist, a trauma coach, a trauma recovery coach. This is why 12-step programs work so well, because the advocacy, you get to talk to someone who's been through it, and just having that conversation to normalize and discuss it. And to Rick's question, it is scary. I just told you, when I admitted that publicly to a room full of people, feeling that I was going to be judged, it was terrifying. I was re-confronting my trauma that had happened to me. It wasn't really about what all those people thought or what they were going to say. It was a fact that I had to re-confront what had happened. It was terrifying, but I ran through the fire and I got out to safety, and I keep doing it. So therapy, trauma recovery coach, support groups, psychoeducation. I can speak, and I know Jami and Michael can back this up. I had done so much trauma work prior to becoming a trauma recovery coach that when I went to the organization to get the certification, I thought I was going to get certification. And I found that there was more trauma for me to work on, because the more I learn about trauma, the more I'm able to discover, and I keep digging deeper and deeper and deeper. So it's a kind of a lifelong thing, but you have to understand it. So psychoeducation, support groups, support networks, those type of things. And that's why I founded Jami mentioned that I founded the Lit Academy. The Lit Academy is a monthly subscription group where we have courses on mental health and trauma education, and we have support groups set up for all month long to be able to contribute. They're facilitated by coaches and therapists, and we have discussion groups around these specific subjects. And that's the entire reason. It's that talking it through with peers and working through it and normalizing for ourselves.
I couldn't agree more. I think, you know, as we've learned in our training here amongst us, that shame is such a powerful master emotion that binds to other emotions and can keep them from completing their life cycle. And that's what keeps us stuck in episodes and feelings and not able to move forward. And it's so difficult to recognize the shame when it's binding to another emotion. And for me, I think the best way to take your power back from shame is by speaking about it. And that's also the most terrifying aspect about shame, is the thought of speaking about it. Sarah, is there any more questions that we can address before we wrap up here?
We have a couple. During this series, will there be an opportunity to workshop these themes?
Oh, that's a great idea. We hadn't actually planned for that, but that's making the wheels turn in my head. So let's say, thank you.
I'd be open to that, Bradley. I'm sure you'd be open to that.
Yeah. Michael, let's talk about that after this. Let's make that happen. Maybe we can, I don't know, Jami, with the format of the way we have things with the three meetings, if there's going to be time for that. If there is, we can work that in. If not, then Michael, we can
do a follow-up afterwards. If people are really interested, they could put in the chat, or they can message the host directly with contact information, email, phone number, whatever would be necessary. Yeah. And I'd be open to that as well.
I think that since we're creating this entire thing, we can do whatever we want. So
so empowering.
Thank you, Bill, for the suggestion.
Another comment, step 2 question, ego recognition and how the ego restricts self-evaluation.
Ooh.
So that's an interesting comment.
That's another hour.
Yeah,
Right.
it is.
of a conversation.
Totally. Totally.
But it really is step two when you begin to see and I'm just going to touch on this quickly because
Sure.
in the name of time, but when we begin to see the ego is not a bad thing.
Mm-mm.
The ego gets a bad rap. It's that dichotomous, right? When you realize
Mhm.
suddenly you have an ego, everybody's like, oh, the ego is bad. No, the ego does you a lot of favors. And that's what we don't have time to go through. But it can also, by default, when it's trying to help you, can hurt you. And recognize that ego recognition and knowing how the ego's driving you based on trauma and emotions, that kind of thing, goes back to everything we've talked about. That's critical. That's that awareness that I was talking about when I was talking about Michael and I are into awareness and mindfulness, is being able to kind of step back and realize, who you really are and what your ego's function is and what it's doing, and separate all that.
Absolutely, Bradley. You're 100% correct. That awareness of your place in the world and your opinion and your programming, and having the self-confidence to know who you are and what you're about. Also having the self-confidence to be able to say, I can be open-minded and challenge my assumptions and programming, and I can let others weigh on in, trained professionals, people who care, compassionate individuals, and learned individuals who can give me other material to consider. And I think this applies to the discussion we're having here today. Pontificating, this kind of goes to maybe solving the world crises we're in right now with regard to communications. Just the concept of having a confidence around our own opinions, but allowing others to actually have their opinions as well and share those with one another so that we can consider them. We may consider healthier ways we can move forward. That's when we talk about strength and bravery. I think a strong opinion that is strong enough to be able to sustain observation, criticism, and growth is a healthy thing.
Thank you, Michael. Sarah, I think we've got time for one more quick question, if there is one.
I'm trying to look back here for just a second. An earlier question, is it strictly a church religion that tells us what is masculine and feminine? That was earlier in the initial conversation about what is.
Well, I would say that's certainly a part of it, but I think it's an evolution thing. When we evolved as human beings and we were in small villages, and other people in other small villages would come and set everything on fire and kill everyone and rape your women and murder your children, the masculinity had to build up, and there had to be that cohesion there of the men that didn't show fear. That's again on that ignorant side, because we weren't as evolved in our consciousness, in our culture, and that's how that masculine cohesion formed. And we heard this a lot when a couple decades ago, when they started talking about homosexuality in the military. They didn't want somebody who was homosexual in the foxhole with them and that kind of thing. But it's because of that ignorant, that bonding thing, that you don't, in that type of situation, you feel like you don't want someone who's vulnerable because, I've lost my words here, but it somehow gives you a false sense of insecurity. Which we know that not to be true through this conversation, but I think it's an evolutionary thing, because we had to defend ourselves and defend our villages and our people.
I think as a person of faith who's kind of grown on up in the traditional Christian church and still continues to participate in that, and full disclosure, I think I'm probably the only progressive-minded person in my very conservative-minded church, so I like to butt heads with them on a regular basis. They don't like me so much for that, but the church certainly does form, weigh in, and has historically for 2,000 years weighed on into definitions of gender norms, masculinity. There are definitely examples there that have an impact on those definitions, but they're substantial, and it's a substantial part of people's deep-seated spiritual belief system. So it definitely informs on their opinion and society overall. They're not the only impacts on masculinity or gender roles. In terms of defining them, there are ever-evolving societal conventions, entertainment, professional atmospheres, you name it, that all have an impact upon defining and redefining what those roles could be and should be. It really depends on us to advance conversations like this to say, how do, I don't necessarily want to jump on out there and say, well, you know, one is wrong. I'd say, why do we feel that way? And why do they feel that way?
Thank you so much, Michael. Well, we've just passed the 1 hour mark already. I feel like this conversation could go on for a few more hours, and we're having this as a 3-part series. I'd like to thank Michael Blanton and Bradley Hall for this amazing dialogue today. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who has tuned in and for asking your questions. I'm sorry if we didn't have time to get to all of them. Feel free to add them in the event page on our Facebook page, Jami Carter BSN RN, and we can possibly answer them there if you feel that they're pressing. Our next panel will meet next week on Sunday, May 1st at 10:30, and this will be a panel of women still addressing the same subject of vulnerability and toxic masculinity in men, and the role that women play in enforcing this conditioning and what we can do to provide a space for men to take that first step. I do believe that this is a conversation that needs to be had among every gender and every gender role out there, so that we can create a space where men can be masculine and feel whatever the heck it is they're feeling. So that will be May 1st at 10:30, and we'll be posting in the event the Zoom link. And then our third session won't be until Sunday, June 5th, also at 10:30. And the subject matter to be determined, as we have gotten a proposal for a workshop, and we'll see what happens. Thank you, Sarah, for monitoring our chat.
Yes.
Everybody, and enjoy your week.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
I enjoyed the conversation, Michael. I appreciate it.
Bradley, appreciate your insights. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Jami.
guys.